Delighted to be here with all of you and with these two incredibly well-regarded investigative journalists. I'm sure they don't need much of an introduction, but Wesley Lowery is the author of They Can't Kill Us All, Ferguson, Baltimore in a New Era in America's Racial Justice Movement, as well as the pretty brand new, American Whitelash, A Changing Nation and the Cost of Progress. He was a lead on the Post-Fatal Force Project, detailing how many people had been shot and killed by the police, which won a Pulitzer Prize for national reporting in 2016. And he's currently a correspondent for 60 in 6 and a political contributor to CNN. Ronan Farrow is the author of Catch and Kill, Lies, Spies, and a Conspiracy to Protect Predators, and numerous New Yorker articles. You're a contributor at The New Yorker and also currently producing documentaries for HBO, and you are also the winner of a Pulitzer Prize. So I have a first question for both of you, and I'll start with Wesley. Is there a moment where you knew you wanted to be a journalist, or was it more of an evolution? Oh, is there a moment where you knew you wanted to be a journalist, or was it more of an evolution?
Well, thank you for that, and it's a really good question. I mean, I think for me, I grew up in a family where my father was a journalist as well, and so for a long time, the answer was that I was doing this despite the fact that my father was a journalist, and now I've gone to enough therapy to understand that actually it's literally the opposite. But what I will say is that there was a time when I was in middle school or early high school, I'd started working for my high school newspaper, and it occurred to me that I could wake up every morning with a question, and I could spend all day calling people who were smarter than I was and asking them all those questions. And then at the end of the day, I could write up what I'd learned, and that was a job I could get paid to do. And that felt like cheating. And however many years later, that is still what I get paid to do.
Ronan, you wrote in your book, I took from your family's history, I took from that a desire to stand on my own, to be known best for my work, whatever it might be. So talk a little bit about that moment and how it led you to journalism.
We're all so Freudian. It's all just rebelling against our parents all the way through. Yeah, I hate to be so predictable. I think it was rooted in family stuff. I don't know which of the books that was from, but one of the things that I write about a lot is I was very grateful for a spirit of public service that kind of pervaded my family background. And, I think that I learned about the ways in which that can be ego-driven and showboating, and the ways, on the other hand, in which it can be substantive and really meaningful. And all of my different jobs I tried had some component of that in it, and a mix of the ego-driven, selfish incentives and the genuine altruistic ones. So I wound up going to law school because I sucked at organic chemistry, and then realizing I didn't want to do big law, so I went off to Afghanistan and worked for the State Department in various places, and had this kind of war zone background. And I think that then furthered my feeling that was an extension of that public service background in my childhood. My mom was very, very Catholic, in a way that was quite punishing at times. She was not a punishing mother, but it created a kind of self-punishing inner voice when it came to these public service issues. And then that was further accentuated, I think, by those war zone experiences, where just no amount of suffering in a country like ours was quite at the level of the suffering I'd seen in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan. And a lot of my siblings, earlier than that, being from really tough backgrounds. I grew up in a family with a lot of adoptions, with a lot of special needs kids. It meant that I had to go through a long evolution, through a period of sprinting through a lot of work in several different formats. Then I was in TV news, and then I was in print, but always kind of hurling myself at trying to use whatever gifts I'd been given with a sense of conscientiousness and responsibility. Not that I always lived up to that. And by the way, not that that's without cause, because what I found was ultimately I then needed to do a lot of therapy to allow myself to catch my breath, realize that more creatively fulfilling, more interesting work, maybe even more valuable to society, would flow from some balance, some consideration of taking in new perspectives, new information, letting in some of the kind of what I, for a long time, only allowed myself to consider selfish incentives to do creatively fulfilling things as well. So I hope my work over time arcs towards a blend of that. And as you're pointing out, journalism can feel like a cheat code in a way towards some of those goals. You can be creative, you can tell people's stories, you can do justice to people's most meaningful experiences, you can expose structural things that are a problem. It's a puzzle, it's a bit of an art form. It's a cool combination of things. I'm really glad I get to do it.
I love that comment about balancing selfish incentives with unselfish ones, because I think it's true of a lot of life. Wesley, to come back to you, I think there's always, part of investigative journalism is realizing that the surface is often not the story. And was there a moment where that became clear to you?
Certainly. I think that one of the things, and I tell this when I teach students and talk about students, right, is that we are still living in America, we're still living in American journalism that is still very much structured in a post-Watergate setup, right? That is still very much about holding power to account, that we aspire to taking down a president, right? Doing big, sweeping investigations that show injustice. And unfortunately, because of the economics of our industry, because of the realities of our industry, the vast majority of people go into journalism and never actually get to do the journalism they aspired to do. That most people are having to work in a structure, in a system where they are on this treadmill and quickly producing and doing small things. And to be clear, that work is important and contributes to the type of work we get to do. But as I worked, this would be going back a decade in Ferguson, Missouri, and other places covering fatal police shootings, the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was this feeling of a limitedness to that. I could be the first one to get the interview with the family, and okay, but this didn't feel like it actually solved anything, right? Or, I could get this little tidbit. And I remember getting back, at the time I was at the Washington Post, and kind of, shamelessly fighting my way over to the investigative desk and demanding I be allowed to be involved in some of the stuff going over there. And I discovered this trap door into a type of journalism that had otherwise been partitioned off from me, where we would actually talk to everyone who was in the story, right? Where we would actually go read the book the person was referencing to see if that was an accurate reference, right? That we would go beyond the accurate capture of what people say and actually seek to litigate, is what they are saying true? And I think that again, I think for all journalists, is what we aspire to do. And I think the beauty of investigative journalism, which I actually think in our era now is should have a more expansive definition. We're really talking about in-depth reporting, journalism that seeks to answer questions, not just raise them. That there's a real beauty to that, and it's a real honor and frankly a privilege. So few of us get to have the resources, the time, and the support to really do that type of journalism, even as most journalists who are working have the capacity and the ability to do it, if only they had that space.
Ronan, there's a line in your book, speaking of power structures that can mask reality, that jumped out at me, and it's when you go to talk to Tom Brokaw, first of all, about Harvey Weinstein, and you walk out saying, is anybody not friends with this guy? And so talk about that, how these power structures can often, that shape the surface, can mask the reality of what's going on.
Well, we're living in the middle of a crisis of culture that I think is born of some of the issues that you've worked on so deeply. Late-stage capitalism run amok, a media that is profoundly distorted by that and that is alienating and dividing people in some ways as a result of that. And when you're doing the kind of work Wesley's talking about, that at times pisses people off, right? Because you're digging for things that are hard to dig for a reason in some cases, and presenting arguments that take work to present because they're uncomfortable. If we're doing our jobs right, that means pissing people off. And so a lot of my work has brought me face to face with very acute examples of the kinds of structures that have a different level of threat attached to them than the work of journalists that I saw in South and Central Asia, for example. And I've done a lot of writing in earlier books about those kinds of settings in geopolitically fraught places where you just wind up dead, right, if you do this kind of work. So the thing we have in this country in terms of the First Amendment being a backbone of our value system and a lifeline for reporters is real, and we're still so fortunate, despite all the stuff that might sound like doomsaying in this conversation, because obviously we're going to get into the ways in which this is all broken. We still have it so good, and it's so precious. And so you're exactly right. A lot of my work brought me face to face with these things. You know, when I choose to write about the meta story, it's because I think it's its own important story. And the things that I dealt with in the course of those events that you're talking about, where people were hired to follow me around, and I had to move out of my home, and then during the Inquirer Trump stuff, I had sexual blackmail attempts, like honeypots sent after me to seduce me. I published my sexts. It's like crazy stuff. And this is what happens if you work on stories that people don't want to come to light. The Trump stuff being really interesting because that was about structures that I could see by then probably violated campaign finance law in some way. Those ultimately did, the stories that I'm talking about, figure heavily in that first, albeit rather shaky, legally speaking, indictment against him in Manhattan. So you look back and you think, well, it's worth it. But at the time, you can face this wall of these kinds of tactics, and you can face an ambient environment where the kinds of conversations you're talking about are everywhere. And the ones you're talking about around the Weinstein case in particular were so hard because I was a young journalist, my show had been canceled, I was doing these investigative stories for the Today Show, similar to Wesley. I always had this frustration with the ephemeral nature of what I was doing in breaking day-to-day news as an anchor. So I was like, let me put a serious story on air where I give a lot of context and dig into a lot of facts. And I very rapidly then ran into these situations where it was clear that the corporate news media structures around me, the economics of the world I was in, just weren't built for that. There wasn't a desire for it. Not that all of the people are terrible. There's wonderful journalists across that world. And even on the non-journalist side, I'm not Manichaean about this. Like the fat cat executives, if you will, they're not all that caricature. They want to do their job, but they don't have an incentive structure because of the business models to seek that particular kind of digging for the truth. So that has since become a real cause for me, not in an activist sense, but in terms of a desire to tell the stories of journalists. Like my last film was a movie called Endangered, where we followed journalists through the pandemic. I'm constantly trying to find ways to work on projects that acquaint the public with the thing Wesley's talking about that's so valuable, that we need this right now for our democracy. We need the exposure of those kinds of facts. And also introduce that meta story that you're alluding to of how hard it is and how many systems are geared against it.
How do you know, there's something you wrote in your first book that really resonated with me, which was, how do you know if you're fighting because you're right or because of your ego and your desire to win and to avoid confirming what everyone thought, that you were young and inexperienced and in over your head? And so for both of you, and I'll start with you, Ronan, how do you know when you're right? Do you ever know that you're right?
Yeah, I think it's very important that you acknowledge when you don't and embrace the idea of not being sure for as long as possible in a repertorial process. I'm working on a story now where I'm having all these conversations with a person staring down a lot of criminal charges, who's very much a pariah in some ways, and I'm really having to explain sincerely, not just as a manipulation tactic, although, by the way, everything we do has a manipulative component in the reporting process, so that's another layer of this to talk about. But there is also a sincere value that I'm trying to explain to this source, where he's like, will I get a fair shake? And I'm going, yeah, because I don't know the truth. And until I get to the finish line, which is the very best approximation of the truth that I can do with all of the resources I can bring to bear, and all of the context and all the facts, I'm going to embrace the idea that I don't know, and I'm going to be open to every single piece of information. Like sometimes I see depictions of journalists, even in attempts to adapt stuff that I've written. I'll read like a movie script version of a journalist character who's talking in terms of activist ideals. There's a lot of let's get that guy. It's like dialogue from a Bruce Willis movie in the 90s or something. Like, this is how they do it. This is how they shut things down. But the reality is actually very kind of unsexily, lawyerly in every step of the process, where I'm basically saying, let's take in as much information as possible and let's not be arrogant about getting dug in. And it can be a tremendous difficulty. You have to open yourself to being humbled. you have to be open after the fact, too, as additional things emerge, to keep riding the wave of that reporting, to keep giving people new information, to keep evolving in your own understanding of the fact pattern.
Wesley, talk about that balance between the ego and the confidence to believe that you're right and the humility to being open to the idea that you might be wrong.
I think that we have to have that openness, and frankly, I think our individual anxieties very often are helpful with this, right? that you're spending the night up going, well, what if that's off, or what if that's not quite true? What if I do think sometimes when we make mistakes, the collective we, is when we take too prosecutorial of a stance. Right, our job is not actually to lay out an indictment. Our job is to lay out the totality of what we know and what we understand, right? And our job is not to be thematically right, but literally right. Did this war criminal commit this war crime? Not they are a war criminal and so therefore. And that can be difficult, right? That can be complex, it can be confusing, right? There are people who are bad people, so therefore people want them to go down, but that doesn't mean the thing they are giving you is true. And vice versa. There are people who are good people, and so therefore and so you have to navigate. There are people who genuinely believe things that are not true, right? Or that are more complex or more complicated than than they might present them to be, right? And so I think what is both difficult, but also what is in a lot of ways, the joy of the complexity of this work is that you are constantly pushing and pulling on the parts of this puzzle. And you are saying, all right, how do I find this little piece, and then how do I find that little piece, and how do I make this call, and how do I do this thing? And again, sometimes that makes for copy that is far less sexy than we would want it to be ideally, but that is far more accurate than sometimes things that maybe some of our colleagues might publish. And I think that because as we know, the world doesn't always fit into very clean narratives. There are almost always complexities and nuances and complications. And so if our job is to reflect objective reality in our piece, that means reflecting the entirety of that objective reality, which includes the things the defense attorney might have to say, or that piece of evidence that doesn't actually quite fit with this bigger, broader thing. And let's lay that out there and let's show people. And I think that can be, again, in the world we live in, isn't even always what our audience wants, much less our editor or whomever else, right? That we like the simple narrative. Good guy, bad guy, terrible thing I'm upset about, the hero who's gonna come in and steal the day, right? It's a lot harder for us sometimes to sit with things that both confirm and contradict the beliefs that we already have.
Ronan, you look like you have something to add to that.
Well, I'm doing like a Hillary Clinton aggressive nod here. I think you've hit on something that increasingly, as I reflect on what we do, feels to me like one of the very most important values to pass on to young journalists. I increasingly view journalism when it's done right, investigative journalism when it's done right, as something that has to be rooted in deep compassion and understanding. It almost is of accord with what one learns as you get deeper into adulthood about like managing relationships, like in your personal life. You're going to fight all day and be in a state of constant conflict if you greet people in a kind of Manichaean way in even the micro interactions you have in your life, right? If you're like, well, they did something bad, they're coming from a bad place. And I've come to, in the much higher stakes capacity of your reporting on anything, even violent crime that's very extreme and that leads to the characterizations Wesley's talking about of this is a bad guy who did bad things. Even if I'm reporting on something that I know might send someone to jail, not obviously through any power that I have, but through those facts then being out there and available to prosecutors, I really view it as my job to try to get into that person's head and understand what they thought they were doing. Was this a compulsion? Was this corruption? What were the bad incentives? And to really create a space where they can describe what brought them there, make every case in their defense, and where hopefully my rendering of what they did and where they came from isn't just, this is a bad guy. It's really trying to pump into it every ounce of compassion and understanding I can, even with the very, very worst kinds of people that I report on or the most abhorrent kinds of crimes. And I think with the passage of time, as I've become associated with stories that have wound up triggering a lot of personnel change at big companies, or kicking people out of government or sending people off to jail, I really came to dislike the way in which when people would hear that I was going to drop a story, there would be these preemptive things that would happen. There'd be reporting about the impending story, and then stock values would change in the market, or people would sort of already there'd be discourse. This is the illusion of discourse in the present day, by the way. It's like 6 people on Twitter. But I'd see people sort of saying like, who's about to get kicked out of society? And it's such a fundamental misapprehension about what I want to do. And I actually think the worse the fact pattern being exposed, the more you need to take care and have compassion. So I have a lot of feeling for when my reporting is confronting, like in the cases that you mentioned with the Brokaw conversation where I was talking about Harvey Weinstein. I really try to keep in my head at the same time, while I'm being as fair and objective as I can, like, here's the cost to the people involved. And it can be true that someone is a terrible, violent criminal, and also that they're terrified, and there are huge existential stakes, and they have family members who are going to suffer. So I try to hold that all at once.
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting lessons for me early on was that life is rarely as simple as bad people setting out to do bad things, and nor would it be very interesting if it were. Wesley, how do you balance that need for compassion, which shows in your work, toward even the worst of worst in you try to get underneath their superficial stories to explain what actually is motivating them?
Sure, I think that frankly for me, coming into a lot of my journalism, having covered a lot of the criminal legal system, having covered and a lot of the issues of race and injustice that factor into them, right? A lot of my sources are black men who are incarcerated somewhere, many of whom have done the terrible thing for which they were accused. I help work with an organization called the Prison Journalism Project, where we go into prisons and to jails and teach writing, right? Not so that these men and women can write even about their own cases, but just simply as a means of them engaging in the public discourse in the public square, right? And rooted in that is the belief that people are not just nouns in headlines, right? They are not just the thing that they got in trouble for, but they are actually 3-dimensional human beings who have something to contribute and to interact with. And so to have that amount of empathy or compassion for some people then requires it for all the other people as well, right? And so I can, on the one hand, do a bunch of journalism about people who maybe have been incarcerated unfairly or unjustly, or who are being mistreated even in their incarceration. Sure, they did the thing, they were rightly convicted, but do they deserve these conditions, or should they be treated this way? I have to hold that same empathy when I'm writing about white supremacists who've committed hate crimes, right? Now, again, that's not actually about, that's not about not holding them accountable. It's not about using euphemism instead of looking directly at what they have done or how they are doing it, right? But it's actually coming from a space of genuinely wanting to know and wanting to understand, which requires seeing humanity, right? It's actually a lot easier to believe that we live in a world of angels and demons. It's a lot harder to grapple with the idea that there are all types of environmental factors or happenstance that separate your actions and mine, right? Well, that's a lot less comfortable. It's a lot easier to think, well, no, that person's just a monster, or that person did a thing I never could do or could never fathom doing, right? It's a lot harder to look and think, okay, well, we were all born, we're humans, and what has happened along the way that has led to these different outcomes. But I think that empathy and that compassion for people, I think is really important. And I do think the ephemeral nature, even when we step out of kind of the moral or ethical questions of the villains and but when we just talk about the media system in general, we move so quickly. People are just characters in a soap opera for a day, and then we move on, right? And I actually think that is in and of itself at times very dehumanizing. What happens after the cameras leave? What happens after, I've done a number of stories that have simply involved finding someone who for a moment in time was the most sought after interview in the country, and then the day changed, and now no one cared about this person anymore. And you call them 6 weeks later and they're sitting at their house with all types of stuff to say, but no one cares. It's, and thinking about what that process of going through being a character is and how that changes people and impacts people as well. Again, I think at the core, even when we're talking about accountability, even when we're talking about investigative work, we still have to hold the humanity of the people we talk about and are writing about at the center of the work that we're doing.
I was thinking about how quickly we move on with the Sam Altman OpenAI story because it was everywhere last fall, and we still don't know why it was that the board decided. And it's a really important question for humanity, and we moved on. I want to come back to some of that, but I wanted to go, Wesley, a question I had for you, a few quotes from your book. A central question was how much the era's racially inflammatory political rhetoric was inciting or at the very least contributing to those acts of racial violence, as well as how much of this rhetoric should be permitted in the public square, and how directly responsible are politicians and political figures who traffic in such invective. And you wrote also, the most pressing question of this era may be how to balance the rights of Americans, even American races, to free speech and free expression, with the government's sacred responsibility to ensure the safety and security of the rest of society. I think it's such a fascinating issue for all of us today, and how do you answer that question? How do we grapple with the right to free speech and the dangers in it?
And I think we do have to grapple with it. And to be clear, I'm on the board of a press freedom group. I believe very strongly in our First Amendment rights and the importance of speech in our public dialogue. And also, right, we live in a country that is 50 or 60 years into a new experiment of what does it mean to be a multiracial democracy and a multicultural society. That was actually not the intent of the founders. It was not the intent of our initial foundational rights and understandings. And so what does it mean now as we now set a new goal as our cornerstone? How does that force us to reconsider not necessarily our values, but the practices by which we carry them out? One of the examples we think of, right, is that there are many other countries that we would not describe as hostile to free speech or discourse or dialogue that think about this very differently, right? Where they would not be defending the rights of Nazis to march through your town square. They would say, actually, in our society, we don't have Nazis marching around. Why? Because that conflicts with our idea of what it means to be safe in a multicultural society, right? We would not argue that those nations don't believe in speech or don't believe in discourse or don't believe in dialogue. There are nations where, there are European nations where you can't take a photograph of someone in public without their consent, right? That's obviously very different than how we think about it here, not necessarily something I might personally advocate for, right? But once again, none of us are prepared to argue that Germany is some repressive fascist regime that doesn't believe in speech and discourse, right? Not today. And so I think that for us, I think there is a real challenge. And this challenge has been there, right? When we, briefly, when you look back to the early 1900s and the time during the midst of the Great Migration, you had civil rights groups that appeared before Congress arguing for the censorship of a play that then became a movie. Arguing that it was going to be so incendiary, that it was so racist, it was going to lead to violence. And the argument from D.W. Griffith was essentially, these people are trying to cancel me, and they should remedy my racist speech with more speech. The NAACP should put on their own play if they don't like A Birth of a Nation. Well, and what happened is we ushered in the era of Jim Crow violence, and thousands of people were massacred. As it turns out, the NAACP was right. That it was going to lead to bad things to have this movie screened across the country. And so it is, in some ways it's easy. It would actually be very easy for me as a journalist to sit here and go, well, of course, I'm a free speech absolutist, and of course, it's a lot harder to come from, certainly in a black journalistic tradition, where if we believe words matter, then we believe words matter. Right? If we believe that there's a power in storytelling, well, then there are stakes to what we allow in our public square and how we interact with that. And I think we can grapple with the question of, we can believe in free speech and dialogue and discourse, and also argue that perhaps the line should be one step different from where it is. And I think that right now, we have a very hard time in this discourse and this dialogue because things become very absolute. You either believe in this thing or you do not. When very often what we're talking about is how we carry this out in practice. What should be allowed in our airwaves? Who should be allowed to march and hang out in our public squares? And of course, that's a thing that society decides, and that line moves and it shifts. But again, if our aim and our goal as our generation of Americans is to create a multiracial, multi-generational democracy, a thing that our grandparents and generations before that fought for but never quite achieved, that might require us tweaking some of the guidelines of how we do that.
Yeah, I've often thought one of the most incorrect old children's sayings is that sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, because words can hurt a lot. Ronan, back to you. How do you one of your most recent pieces, which really resonated with me, was on one of the staunchest defenders and biggest hypocrites about free speech, namely Elon Musk.
I thought you were going to say the RuPaul profile I just wrote.
That's where I thought we were going.
This makes more sense.
No, I'm obsessed with Musk. So how do you think about this question of who gets to speak in our society and who doesn't? Who gets to speak and who gets silenced, which I think is also a theme running through your work.
It is. And I think that my views on these complicated questions of, for instance, where to draw the lines in social media censorship, and these are subtleties too. It's what is actually permitted and not permitted versus what's elevated, right? Platforming things is different from allowing things to happen without criminalizing them. A lot of my views on that debate are rooted in those early experiences in repressive police states, where you see how quickly the ability to move the lines, to cut out parts of the discourse can be abused. And the truth is, there is less thriving investigative journalism in a lot of the kinds of European countries that you're talking about.
Absolutely.
It's very, very hard to publish confronting investigative work in Australia, in England. I've had books banned in both of those places and only reinstated for sale after hue and cry. And I think that is something that scares me as a slippery slope.
Of course.
And when I look at the front lines of the culture war now, and the things that are being weaponized by, for instance, the elements in the current political discourse that I reported on a lot around January 6th. They did a series of stories that at a time when some of those rioters were on the run from the FBI, sort of tracked them down and did what was designed to be the compassionate portraiture that we've been talking about. Really looked at okay, how did you wind up going from being a suburban mom in Philly to slamming a battering ram against a window at the Capitol? What's going on with this? And one of the through lines that I found, and this is nothing revelatory, you can see it in the political discourse everywhere now, is this weaponization of a certain kind of book-burning politics that emerges, I actually think, at both extremes, on both sides of the aisle. I saw it recently. I was teaching a course at Columbia Journalism School this past semester, and in a lot of ways, I think the Gen Z set brings a lot of wonderful accountability into the discourse, a lot of sensitivity into the discourse, but in other ways, the alt-right characterization of that political set is not inaccurate. There is a kind of, a snowflake, let's burn the books, let's run away from opposing views element to the discourse that is somewhat generational. I dealt with cases where, I had a student who looked weeks ahead in the syllabus, saw that a speaker was coming who was of a set of political views and an ethnic background where the student felt that they would be threatened by that person being in the classroom. And the long notes that I got about this, and it was a lovely story because in the end, after some carefully worded emails where I said, don't come if you're going to be uncomfortable, but please know your views are welcomed, and if you want to come and engage, you should. Afterwards, that student did come up to me and say, I'm so glad that I came, and I didn't feel triggered, and actually that was a really sensitive discussion about really difficult things, and I felt I learned a lot from the guest speaker. And I think that's a microcosm for a lot of my fears about the political ramifications of more censorship as well. And I've written in some cases, 10 years ago, I wrote a piece for the Washington Post about the legal lines on things like beheadings, real examples of violent extremism flourishing on social media, and what should those companies do about that. So I'm not an absolutist either. But there's a lot of absolutism in me because I do think it can very quickly get very, very bad. And I I think, you can easily envision a scenario where, for instance, under a future Trump regime, there's a banning of like women's groups protesting, black groups protesting. So I think this is an issue that really matters in real time, and I get very fearful of the pro-censorship arguments, even when they're like an iota too permissive.
Of course.
I wanted to come back to where we started, some of the threads we touched on at the beginning of this conversation. This has obviously not been a great year for journalistic organizations in terms of the business model. Wesley, what do you worry about? What makes it hard for you to do your work, and what makes it hard for young people you see coming up to do their work? And are there bright spots?
Of course. I mean, I think we're in such a miserable late-stage capitalism space around this, right? We have decided that news and information, because news itself is like a construct of capitalism, right? But information, the core factual understanding of our world, which we know we need, it is the central resource to a popular democracy, right? We have decided that it is a commodity to be sold at the market. And that system has not served us particularly well. I think that it's very concerning. I think what we see and what we have seen is the crumbling and the breakdown of that system that was never, again, intended to actually serve that information to everyone in the country. And so as we build a country that we actually seek to be democratic, to be egalitarian, what would it require and what does it look like? And I'm encouraged that we're seeing more conversations about what does it look like to have, whether it be more public funding or some public funding. I'm encouraged by us having more conversations about what does it actually mean to have local information ecosystems that serve the information that people need, not necessarily what we believe you should care about, but what you actually need in order to be fully participant in our democracy. But we are in a really difficult space. I'm involved with a number of news organizations on boards, volunteering, working with, and everyone right now is in a space that is very, very difficult. And as I talk to young people, as I teach students, they're horrified about, again, to go back to something we talked about earlier, the question of will they ever be able to do the journalism that they dream of doing and aspire to do? Which is resource intensive, which is expensive, which takes time, which is complicated. And unfortunately, while we have more information out there than ever before, unfortunately, there is less space to see that type of journalism very often. And I know the students who I work with are desperate to get to do that type of work, even as our market, our system, our industry has failed to provide enough pathways to do that.
Ronan, what concerns you most about the current ecosystem?
Well, everything. Yeah, the bottom has really fallen out of the business model. Again and again, we all have this conversation that Wesley's talking about with young journalists who have no idea how the heck they're going to make a living doing this. There's these headwinds of political arguments against journalism, these old fascist tropes of, the press are the enemy of the people, making it into a less glamorous, less desirable profession than ever, even an embattled, if not dangerous one. And I think that a small part of the solution can be talking about journalism more, telling the stories of journalists more. We as a culture are so immersed in glamorizing storytelling about military and intelligence careers, and there's very little of that for journalism, which is an intrinsic difficulty, right? Like, you watch All the President's Men or Spotlight, and those are like the best examples of dramatizing this sort of thing. And it's people with their notepads. It's not that sexy. So I get it, but I think it's incumbent on all of us to explain to people the value that you just hit on, that it all falls apart if we don't have access to information. And I'm interested in both of your views, whether we have time to do it now on stage for the audience or just in conversation after, on what you see working around you. Because we have all these conversations in our profession right now about what doesn't work, which is just about everything business model-wise. But there are all these experiments of, there's the philanthropy models happening, there's the subscription models happening, I hope for all of you, you identify whatever that news organization that you're passionate about is and find a way to support them. Even if you give a little money to ProPublica, like you're doing real good in the world. I'll selfishly say if you subscribe to the New Yorker, you're doing real good in the world. The Washington Post, like there are great outlets doing great work right now, and there's just no future model that anyone can rely on, and it's a scary time for all of us as a result.
Yeah, Wesley, if you have one last note of optimism, that was a little bit of optimism,
well,
Ronan. So if you have
what's working?
If you have
Bring
one
us
last
home,
note of
Wesley.
optimism to close on, that would be great.
I think one of the things I would say is I do think there are a lot of experiments happening now, especially in the nonprofit space, not just the ProPublicas and the Marshall Projects, and again, all places that we should all give money to and support, doing great work. But in local places, thinking about what are the needs of organizations. So I'll name one and then I'll stop, right? But there's an organization called City Bureau in Chicago that started a program called the Documenters. And the idea around it's now expanded to a number of cities where they would engage members of the community to show up and create written records of public meetings. That here in the third largest city in the country, the majority of government gathering was not being recorded for the public record by anyone. And so the idea and the thought here was you were taking citizens and you were engaging them in the civic information and the civic ecosystem. You are both creating a record that otherwise would not exist, but you're also, that individual now knows more about their government, their city, the place that this works. And so I think as we look at the future, again, the democracy we want to build, it's going to be one in which we all have to be far more civically engaged. And one in which our news and information ecosystem provides more of the essential information that we need, which despite, the news junkies in here, actually really isn't the micro update about whatever's going on with Fannie Willis and the Georgia case right now. It's about what's happening down the street from our home, right? And I think that as we begin building that and rebuilding that, I think the thing that's been most encouraging for me has been a lot of these community-driven efforts that have really been focused on small d democracy, the place where you live, the needs of your community, your neighbors. And unfortunately, that's not something that big capitalism is going to support all the time, but it's something that we collectively can.
Local news, and that's one of the segments of the market that is dying the worst business deaths we're seeing right now. So these kinds of creative ways into that local coverage are so essential. And I think like the optimism that springs to mind hearing you talk about that is also in evidence on this stage. Like you have here journalists who have told important stories in compelling ways, both of you have, and that is still something people respond to. And whatever the business model that ultimately lands as the solution, I don't actually think that what you guys do is at risk of going away. And the local version of it, I think people will always find a way, because I've seen how people respond when you do that humanistic thing. You capture the stakes, you capture why it matters, and you tell the stories that aren't getting told enough with a lot of compassion. So I'm glad you guys are out there doing that. I'm glad you guys are here caring about that. And I think that'll bring us to a place where we do have news in the future in one form or another.
I love closing on an optimistic note.